Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Bologna Institute for Policy Research speaker seminar. And really pleased today to have Dr. Emily Holland, a former colleague of mine at the U.S. Naval War College. She is now based in Berlin, and she has two hats there. One, she is an international security fellow at the Center for International Studies at the Hertie School. And she is also recently appointed as the director for the Eurasian program for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is a think tank based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but she is based in Berlin to run the Eurasia program there. She was a research director and assistant professor at the War College. Before that, she was an assistant professor at the Naval Academy, got her degrees at Columbia, all of them, right? Bachelor, master's, and PhD. Her area of focus is on Russia and Europe and Eurasia, and she's been doing a fair amount of work, a lot of work, as a matter of fact, including receiving a lot of grant money for Minerva fellowship on critical infrastructure, critical minerals, and so sort of economic security elements. And so today she's going to talk about critical infrastructure in Europe. For those of you who played in the war game, there were some interesting moves about some of that. And so you'll hear some echoes of some of those things today. So I'm going to pass the floor to her, and she'll give about a half an hour presentation, and then we'll have Q&A after that. Thanks very much for being here, Emily.
Thanks, Drew. And I'm really thrilled to be here again to speak to you all. I've done a lot of work on critical infrastructure in recent years, and part of that was I actually went to work for NATO. I was at NATO MARCOM, where I was the deputy political advisor for the newly established cell for the protection of critical undersea infrastructure. So I spent 2024 actually working on this issue for NATO. And that was a newly established institute. And I'll talk about that a little later in the talk. And I think probably, I hope what can make this an interesting discussion is I come from this as an academic practitioner who then actually went to work in the field. And so I'm going to start the first half of the talk by talking a little bit about theory, about what hybrid and infrastructure attacks mean, what they do, why they work. And then I'm going to transition into the latter half of the presentation to think about how, as in policy, we respond to that and the differences between the academic side and then translating it to actually working on it in policy, because it was a very quite substantial difference. So, okay, I'll start it really basically. What is a hybrid attack? You guys hear about them all the time. You've probably seen in the news. There's been some pretty high-profile ones this week. There was a sabotage on a rail line in Poland that was bringing military equipment to Ukraine that they have, of course, blamed on the Russians. It's unattributed right now. There's basically acts of sabotage on infrastructure almost every day across the European continent of varying size and scale. So what is a hybrid attack? I think you guys know, but it's a hybrid threat that combines military and non-military attack. And there's all different ways that you can have a hybrid attack. So there's cyber attacks, obviously, attacks on infrastructure, sabotage. We saw that this week in Poland, disinfo and influence, economic pressure, that also counts, covert military activity, and then diplomatic manipulation. So, for example, there's little green men into Crimea. That's hybrid action. Diplomatic, it can be using vetoes or even procedural delays in like the UN or the OSCE to stall investigations. That counts as hybrid, believe it or not. Disinfo, you could say, for example, the 2016 campaign to influence the US elections. And then economic pressure. Can you think of any examples for that? Okay, one very prominent one from my own history of work is gas cutoffs, for example. So shutting off the gas to Ukraine in 2006 and 2009 in the middle of winter. That's an example of sort of a hybrid attack. So it really, it encompasses the whole of society. And again, like from the definition, this is one that comes from NATO, by the way, is that hybrid methods really blur the line between war and peace. And the aim of it is not actually the act of sabotage itself. It's to influence and sow doubt in the minds of target populations. And that's why Russia has been using this so effectively for so long, because they argue that democratic populations and democratic societies are much more vulnerable to this type of coercion, because democratic populaces basically cannot stand to take the pain of these sorts of attacks. And so, for example, some people in Russia have argued that their populations are uniquely prepared to withstand these types of attacks, so they're kind of inured to them, whereas Western populations, and particularly democratic populations, are not. So why are they so effective? And this is going to get to why they're so hard to combat. Well, one is it's extremely asymmetric action. Attacks are very, very cheap and effective, but responses are very, very expensive. So I'll give you an example from my own history as working on critical undersea infrastructure. You can do billions of dollars worth of damage by simply dragging your anchor across the seafloor. We'll talk about that in more detail later, but that costs basically nothing. And do you know how expensive it is to fix a set of interconnectors or a gas pipeline? It can cost billions or millions of dollars. It can be extremely disruptive. You could also pay somebody on Telegram 200 euros to put some flyers up or to tamper with an electrical box. That can again cost tons of damage and tons of in terms of capital requirements, but also in terms of time to fix it. It also again leverages this uncertainty, so it works in the gray zone. So who should respond to it? Like if something blows up on a rail line, who is responsible for fixing it? Is it the government? Is it the owner of the rail line? Is it somebody transporting their goods across? Those lines become very unclear. So then it becomes difficult to fix in terms of money, but also it takes some time at the beginning to figure out who's responsible for it, who needs to fix it. It also is deniable, and there's attribution problems. So for example, in the case of dragging an anchor across the seafloor, well, in a recent example, the Nunu polar bear, this was a vessel, it was a Hong Kong flagged vessel that dragged its anchor back and forth and back and forth and back and forth across the Baltic seafloor. It severed the Baltic connector. The captain of that vessel, which had just come from St. Petersburg, by the way, argued that this was just a terrible accident, poor seamanship. Well, can you prove that that's not the case? No, it's basically impossible to prove that that's not the case. But if you look at it from like a attribution side, you know that this is almost, you know, the seamanship has to be so poor it borders on laughable, but you can't say that they're lying about that. So again, that's part of the deniability and attribution. You don't have concrete evidence to say you did this on purpose. And if you don't have evidence to say you did this on purpose, how can you attribute who's responsible for fixing the damage? It's really hard. And then again, it speaks to that risk tolerance piece. So adversaries believe that democracies are really restrained and are less willing to accept the pain that comes along with these sorts of attacks. So how do you combat this? Well, this fun diagram, this comes from the NATO hybrid COE in Helsinki. And they put together this thing called the core model, which is a whole of society approach to countering hybrid attacks. And as you can see, it's quite complicated. And I put this up there for a reason. So according to the hybrid COE's approach, you counter the uncertainty of hybrid attacks by improvising or improving multi-domain awareness, right? So by clarifying responsibilities, by strengthening systemic and society resilience, by making rules and responses predictable, and by practicing decision-making under ambiguity. Does this seem easy to do? These are all such hard things to do individually, right? And then you put them together, it becomes near impossible. It's very, very difficult. So hybrid operations, they're designed, they create this uncertainty, ambiguity about the actors, the intent, the severity. And so you're trying to reduce all of this at every level. But that's really hard because it is a whole of society approach. Europe in particular is extremely vulnerable. Uniquely vulnerable, one might say. There are very highly integrated energy networks, digital infrastructure. This map, which I know is quite small, this is just some of the gas infrastructure across Europe. Not even all of it, just some of it. There is a lot of dependence on cross-border supply chains. It's a very open information environment. There are complex legal and governance structures, overlapping areas of authority. and public-private ownership structures, and cross-border and multinational ownership. So for example, let's say you have a pipeline that goes between Germany and Norway. What happens if that pipeline is disrupted? Who's responsible for coming to the aid? Who's responsible for looking at it? Is it Norway? Is it Germany? What happens if it's in international waters? What if the company that owns it is a multinational based in Switzerland? Who's responsible for that? Unfortunately, that has taken a long time to figure out, and it's still not yet sorted out. And it's different for every single piece of infrastructure. So it's not like you can say, this person is always going to be responsible for figuring it out at this particular point in time. So it's super, super challenging, especially in Europe when you're dealing with all of these different, the nature of things being super cross-border. Okay, so now let's get into the sort of meat of it. This is the ship, container ship. This is the new polar bear. This is the one that dragged its anchor across the Baltic Connector in October 2023. It severed communication cables and a gas pipeline near the Finnish or Estonian border. So you can look actually at the AIS data, and you can watch this ship travel back and forth across the connector multiple times. And you can think, as an educated person, there's no way that this was not deliberate, right? This is the pipeline here, that's the severed Baltic connector. They argue that this is poor seamanship. This is still in litigation and investigation. How can you prove it's not poor seamanship? It's interesting that this was a Chinese flagged vessel that just came from St. Petersburg at the time, and that they found lots of crates of Russian vodka aboard the ship. That's interesting. But what does that actually mean? It's very difficult. Does anybody know what the image on the right is? Yes, that's Nord Stream 2. That is when there was an explosion and it was released gas into the Baltic Sea. So we've all heard about the stories of what happened there. And that creates another interesting challenge right now. Does anybody know what's happening with the litigation of Nord Stream 2 right now in terms of the active sabotage? Yes. Yes, just exactly. So just this week, there's one of the people that was arrested, a Ukrainian individual who was arrested for basically diving down and planting explosives on Nord Stream 2. Germany is trying to extradite them back because Nord Stream 2 was a German legal entity at this point. They're trying to extradite them back into Germany to try them for this act of sabotage, but Poland does not want to give them back. Obviously, Ukraine does not want to give them back. But this raises a whole bunch of issues, right? So if you're looking at war as taking it outside of the battlefield, moving it away from the prescribed legal norms of fighting, what happens in the legal regard? So was Germany a combatant during a war in a war? No, they're not. So who's responsible for damaging German property? But this is also multinational property. This was a multinational called Nord Stream 2 AG that was a Swiss company that actually had interests from Italian firms. E&I had a huge, German, Swiss, French. I mean, it was many different companies had a lot of money riding on this project, and it was destroyed by a saboteur. So Germany argues that this is a legal issue that must be resolved in German courts. Poland refuses. Why are they refusing to do this? Why won't they extradite him back? They believe this is a political issue. So that sort of moving between the legal and the political is another reason why infrastructure attacks are extremely complicated, because they don't sit at the nexus of war, but obviously they are very involved in war. Okay, so how do we respond? There are so many directives and coordinating bodies, NATO frameworks. I won't read them all to you here, but there are just tons of different directives aimed at trying to say who owns the obligations for what in terms of protecting infrastructure across Europe. The NATO bodies, there is a division called the Emerging Security Challenges Division that sort of leads NATO's hybrid and cyber policy. They sit in one bucket, and that's by design. They established in Vilnius in 2023 a cell to try to protect undersea infrastructure at NATO HQ. And then as a result of that, they then established the NATO Maritime Center for Security of Undersea Infrastructure at NATO MARCOM, Maritime Command, that was going to be the operational center for figuring out how to protect NATO's undersea infrastructure. And this was established in April 2024. This is me at MARCOM with Admiral Utley, who's the maritime commander of NATO. And this is when we got our little group off the ground. And it was a very big challenge because we had to sort out a lot of questions before we were able to sort of get to the meat of how to do this. And we're going to talk about that now. Okay, what is critical undersea infrastructure? What's an example of it? Anybody know? Telecom cables? What else? Absolutely. Gas pipelines? What else? Okay, ports, terminals, offshore platforms, oil fields, refineries, tankers, power generation, choke points, even SLOCs, sea lines of communication, SLOCs. So that's a lot of stuff, right? All of that is critical undersea infrastructure. That's a lot. Well, what kind of things threaten that? What's a threat to all that infrastructure? Natural disasters, sabotage, terrorism, climate change, state-sponsored threat, poor seamanship.
Yeah, accidents.
Accidents.
Yeah, real
Accidents.
yeah.
Accidents.
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to know what the biggest, what causes the most damage to undersea infrastructure? Can anybody guess? Fishing. By far, most damage to critical infrastructure, I think 80% is done by fishing. So a lot of times it is just accidents. Okay, so given that spectrum, how can you protect it? If you're NATO, you're sitting there, you're like, okay, I have to protect ports, terminals, offshore platforms, undersea data cables, oil rigs, pipeline, refineries, SLOCs from climate change, accidents, fishing, terrorism. How do you protect that? Where do you even begin? So the scale and the scope of the problem is massive. And that's a huge challenge, even from the outset. And kind of an interesting question to begin with is you say, okay, these things are all critical undersea infrastructure, but how do you define what actually is critical infrastructure? What's critical? How do you define that? Critical to who? How do you scale criticality? So these are all the sort of questions that you have to ask yourself as a policymaker, first of all. And they seem really simple, right? So you think like, okay, hasn't NATO gone beyond that? No, right? Like this question actually takes a huge amount of resources to think through. How can you, using data, actually think through how can I analyze and scale what is critical and to who? And that's actually a very, very complicated question if you really think about it, right? Again, another practical challenge is the nature of the threat. It's asymmetric. So that anchor, that can drag and cause so much damage. And how can you protect against every single ship that is going over this massive amount of ocean? Well, you just can't. You just don't. There's also a problem of geography, right? A huge range of diverse array of actors. So that's a real big challenge. That's something like an internal coordination challenge called C2, sort of command and control, understanding people's roles and responsibility, right? So let's think about the number of stakeholders that are involved in just the protecting critical undersea infrastructure. What kinds of national bodies might be involved in protecting critical undersea infrastructure? Coast Guards? Department of Energy? Navies? Police? Ministries of Economy? Transport? State? And then on the private sector, multinational firms? Insurance? It's huge. So that's just actually a small number of stakeholders that might have an interest or be involved in the protection of critical undersea infrastructure. That's the mariner, exactly. And that is just at the national level. If you're at NATO, think about them multiplying that by 32 member states. How do you begin to think about who reports things to who? And this was sort of learned the hard way and on the fly when a lot of these things happen, when Baltic Connector happened, when Nord Stream 2 happened, right? Because when Nord Stream 2 happened, for example, does anybody know who was first responsible for investigating what happened there?
The Swedes or Danes?
The Danes,
Danes?
the Danish Coast Guard, and then the German Federal Police. And so in every country, one thing that we learned very quickly on the job at NATO was that every country had a different body that was responsible for investigating a certain kind of attack. And that within each country, a lot of countries didn't even know themselves who was supposed to be coordinating these attacks. So you'd go to a state unnamed and you'd say, who is responsible for being the first person to call when something happens from the private sector? They didn't know. So one of the first things that we had to do at NATO was just do an exercise in thinking through what is your own internal mechanism for when there is an incident against CUI. And that took a long time. And that's even before you get to the multinational response, right? If you have that internal response, then what does that mean for bringing it to NATO? Well, you run into a second set of difficulties, which is what was one of the main things that we needed to know about countering hybrid attacks? It's domain awareness. You need to know what's going on, right? That's really hard given the scope of everything. It's also really hard because who are the operators here? Private sector. Do you think that they want to share a lot of their data information with governments? No, they don't. Do you think that there is a map that exists with all pieces of critical infrastructure across Europe? Do you think that exists? That would have been so helpful for us, right? We could have said, okay, here's all the stuff we have to protect.
Right.
Here's how critical it is. Let's do it. That does not exist. Do you know why? Because states do not want to share it with each other and or NATO. So I will speak on a broad level to avoid classification issues. But for example, if you sent out a form and you're like, please tell us where all your critical infrastructure is to all NATO member states, do you think that they would respond? Some states would not want to respond to that. So you're sitting in NATO and you're saying, I don't even know what the critical infrastructure is, who owns it, how are we supposed to protect it? We had a joke actually within NATO at the time was that we should just call the Russians because they would probably have a better idea than we did at this point because they have the map, right? We didn't, but they had the map. Yeah. So why are the Russians so good at this? Well, Russia spent a very, very significant amount of effort investing in capabilities that allow it to threaten, in particular, critical undersea infrastructure, but infrastructure in general, since the Soviet era. And this is something that we did not do, but they did do. They had a real emphasis on demonstrating their ability to target economically vital assets. And they've been doing that since the 1970s. And this can be found in across Russian thinking on escalation management, right? Which presumes correctly and or otherwise that their ability to inflict economic harm will help advance Russia's assets. So they have things like deep diving submarines that can sever cables at depths, which make repairs, again, extremely difficult. They can also tap sensitive undersea cables. They're quite limited in their ability to do that, though. And then there are these motherships, these like special submarines where you have deep diving submarines for longer transits, and then they have little small submersibles that come off from them and can do all kinds of interesting things. One of those famous submarines is the Belgorod. You might have heard this. It looks like a whale, right? And there's a lot of different combinations of auxiliary and surface vessels that are operated by the Russian Navy. And it's spread all sort of across the various aspects of the Russian military. You probably heard of something called Guji. You know what Guji is? Guji is a very, very famous specialized body in Russia that was founded in 1965, actually. And it operates kind of separately from the rest of the Russian Navy. And basically, it's an intelligence gathering service. And they've been operating since the 1960s to go to very, very deep depths to monitor the ocean floor, but to also do whatever else is there is. They're getting information, tapping things, they can sever things all over. And, they don't exclusively do sabotage, but they do a lot of it. And there's all the other vessels in the Russian Navy which can do a lot of different things. There's a ship called the Akademik Vladimirsky, which belongs to the Russian Navy, which is often spotted around interesting accidents that happens and then skirts away. But again, attribution is very, very difficult, and that's by design, right? So how can NATO respond if you can't attribute? You'll never get a NATO consensus to respond to something if you don't have discrete evidence. I mean, regardless, even if you do have discrete evidence, right? So that paints a rather grim scenario about what to do, how to protect infrastructure across Europe. Well, there are some things that you can do and that have happened that are really helpful recently. Okay, so NATO in particular says that critical undersea infrastructure is not just undersea, but it encompasses the entire domain. So it's the subsea, it's the surface, and it's also space. So it's thinking through this entire area of operations and how can we protect and understand it. The big thing is enhancing situational awareness. And this is sort of where a lot of the security bodies are working now. How can we better understand what is happening in the space we are trying to protect? How can we understand what is normal versus abnormal? So for example, if NATO wants to know if there's some unusual activity around, let's say, a cable or an offshore platform, you need to know what normal is. That's really hard to do, actually, because multinational companies are always doing unusual things. They might have a planned maintenance operation that takes things offline. They might be flying drones around, right? You never know. So you have to have understanding of what is normal to be able to understand what is abnormal. And that takes a lot of cooperation by reaching out to the private sector. And Drew and I were talking about this earlier. It's harder than you might think to get the military and the private sector to speak to each other. It's really tough. There's a lot of sort of mutual suspicion on both sides. The private sector itself is reluctant to share information. Like, why do we want to give our information to the government, to the military? And the military, I think, is sometimes a little bit scared to approach the private sector because there's this wall. So when I was at NATO, I spent a lot of time working with private sector companies, the big hyperscalers, Microsoft in particular, because, by the way, who's the new infrastructure providers? These hyperscalers. They're the ones that are building data cables at rates of like 600% over the next 10 years because they have to increase capacity for AI generation needs. So you code to them and you say, please help us to understand what is normal so that we can get a better sense of our situational awareness. AI tools is going to be really helpful in this. So AI is being used a lot in the security space right now to be able to tell different like abnormal patterns of behavior from both ships and connecting that to what's happening on the infrastructure side versus normal behavior. So again, that if you know what's abnormal, you can say what's happening at this specific space and time, and you can send either ships out. They have Baltic Sentry, which you might have heard, which is a huge operation where they have just more vessels out there sort of looking to see and increasing presence. It's acting as like a very traditional deterrent, right? And then there's all kinds of projects like Helsing has this Lura project, which are undersea drones, which go out and basically just listen to the underwater for everything. And then they come up, they send some data to some satellites. And then if there's something unusual, they will surface, right? So there's all these different tools that you can do to sort of leverage technology and big data and AI to help you with sort of understanding what's the domain. And then that's the only way that you can respond. And then beyond that, you have increasing strategic resilience. And this is sort of where we sit in the strategic side. What are the practical things that need to be done first? The first one is easing information sharing. And this seems so easy, but it's actually the hardest thing of all of this. It is so hard to share information either at a government to government level, but on a public private sense in real time, it does not exist. It's impossible. So if we were to say, we need to understand what you are doing, Microsoft, in this whole area at any given time, it's an impossible ask. It's so hard, but increasing that ease of information sharing is the only way if you want to have a good understanding of what I need to protect, right? So that's a huge one. And that comes from just building trust. And I think something that we say a lot, but is really underestimated in international relations in particular, is building trust. This is like one of the most important things. And you think, oh, within NATO, we're all friends. Yeah, that's not how it is, right? You need to build trust within NATO, within your own regions. And that comes from person to person contacts. I mean, this is something that when Drew and I were working at the Navy for a long time, there were certain leaders that would just convene all the time so that you could get generations of leaders in the same room building personal relationships so that when they went off and were heads of Navy or whatever, they could call their counterparts and have a basis of trust with that person. That's huge. And those person to person contacts really come in handy. We saw that really specifically at the start of the Ukraine war, for example. So Drew and I used to do these courses together where it would bring like 1 and 2 star together to at sort of the beginning of their officer career to go through these courses together. And they'd meet and they'd all form a WhatsApp group every year and they'd keep in touch with the WhatsApp group. When the war in Ukraine started, one of the really interesting things that happened was a lot of weapons started to come into Ukraine, and they would start to come in with instruction manuals that were not in Ukrainian or in English. And so what we started to see was you start to see people on the WhatsApp group saying, can I translate this? Can I get you the directions from my home language? Like through these WhatsApp groups to actually being deployed in Ukraine. So again, that building of trust is super important on the battlefield and kinetic action, but also in trying to protect energy and infrastructure as well. Of course, the main plan is redundancy, diversification, right? So building more of what you need so that if something is cut off, it's not going to be a complete catastrophe. And that's in energy supply chains, data and comms and everything. So right now, sort of the big plan for protection across all of infrastructure is redundancy. That's going to be difficult, especially now that we're running into capacity issues for energy generation with AI. So that's going to be a challenge in thinking through how to protect all of that infrastructure moving forward. This speaks to my last point, but scenario-based planning and exercising, so just testing cooperation, testing command and control is huge. We did that at NATO, for example. Just practicing. If something happened here, who do you talk to internally? And then who does that person reach out to as a counterpart in another state? Just literally practicing that and understanding from that exercise that you don't know, that's valuable in itself, right? Or and then figuring out, okay, how can we begin to plan this or who can we call? Hugely valuable. And again, that's something that I know you guys are doing here. You guys are doing wargaming. Like that stuff is actually used in policy and it's very, very helpful. This one is the hardest, is societal resilience. That's the biggest question, right? And one of the huge things is media literacy and transparency and educating people to understand what is being said in the media, what propaganda is, what is not, and learning how to trust and use your best judgment to understand the messages that are being put forth. Rapid strategic communication is also really helpful in these situations. And that resilience should act as a deterrent, right? To make these very cheap actions of disrupting critical infrastructure to making it a little bit less effective. And I will stop there and we can have questions. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was great. So many questions and so many things, yeah, that I will hold mine for everybody else. Lots of stuff that come to mind about other things for me, for resilience and redundancy, about the who pays question, right? Which is another big piece of this. And then whether there's also a role for trying to increase the costs for the actors who undertake these things. So those are two things I'll put just aside for now. So with that, open the floor for questions and comments. Who's got some? Anyone? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, so we can record it. Hi, Andy Webb. So my question is, as you worked in NATO, it seems the Russians historically have been very good at thinking broadly about the tools available to them as they implement national policy. The Americans seem to, at least recently, maybe since Vietnam, not so good at doing so. Just across NATO, how do you think the cultural differences impact how people are thinking about this problem and how they intend to maybe do the same as a counter?
That's a great question, right? Because in many ways, like the Russians are a bit right in that we are hamstrung in our ability. We can't just go out and blow up other people's infrastructure. That's against our laws, right? In general, for the most part. And so that is a difference. I think also what you get when you get the Russians, if you think about them as a society, if you think about them as war fighters and as strategic planners, Russia is very good at leveraging its comparative advantages. So for a very long time, they have always understood that they would be conventionally defeated against NATO or whoever. And so they had to think about ways in which they could exert national power without having that traditional deterrent. And so they did things like try to control European energy flows, right? Or I don't know, blow up a pipeline or whatever. I mean, like all of these different things, because that was a way that they could exert their national power. Now, what you have in NATO right now is or in Europe in general, I'll be less specific, is you have a bit of a schism between states that are wedded to a more traditional way of understanding conflict and participating in conflict, that are more committed to domestic and international rules of governing behavior. And then you have some states which are, let's say, more willing to be flexible about the roles that they play in what they decide as conflict. And I think you can kind of look at a map, and if you go a little bit further east, then maybe you get a little sense of people's willingness to engage in that. Like depends on their appetite for what they view as risk, right, and what they view as threats. And so there are, I mean, this is played out, for example, right now in the extradition issue between Poland and Germany. There's some differences in understanding like what are the rules by which we play this game. And I think many people, specifically on the hybrid issue, are like, we are living in an old world, but there's new rules. And so how do you adjust to that? I personally have been asked to participate in non-governmental, but in think tank exercises in thinking through offensive actions that the Western states could take in terms of hybrid. So I did like a theoretical critical infrastructure offensive campaign that I did with actually Nick at ISSS, and thinking through what that might look like given how we are restricted to act by laws, but also if you're removing some of those things, what could we do and what would hurt them? So there is that thinking going on, certainly, and at least in the think tank community, I'm sure in other communities as well, but it does run into some legal issues on the Western side.
Hello, my name's Cole Shryock, first year IR student. I was curious what some of the technological advancements that you're able to tell us about are being used for increased monitoring and visibility across the oceans and different theaters.
So AI is really making a huge change in that because, as I said, it's impossible to monitor every inch of the ocean all the time. Like we just don't have the resources and capacity to do that. But what there are now is there's a lot of different programs being developed to again integrate many different sources of data. So whether you get that from the private sector or whether you get that from various different monitoring capabilities within different navies or militaries, trying to integrate those together to build a picture of what is happening, like a picture of situational awareness. And so using AI, like training models to get a sense of what all of those things and get them to speak to each other at one time. And that's happening in real time. Like that's being used now and developed by different bodies. Like NATO Diana has one. That's the NATO's science arm. They're developing one. There's all sorts of different tools. Like there are private companies like Planet Labs that are working together to integrate data from satellites and everything to just bring a better sense of domain awareness to places that are trying to monitor. So that's changing things very fast, actually. I think you could argue that, unfortunately, in critical infrastructure and hybrid in general, the West has to have a much more reactive strategy. So like we are reacting to things that have already happened, which is not great, right? But I think the hope is that like these tools can just give us such a better sense of the overall domain that we'll be able to respond much faster and possibly to attribute if we have all these different sources of data that be able to take pictures and put things together.
Hi, my name's Ben. I'm a second year IR student. I wanted to pick up on that point about reactivity, and whether there's mechanisms through which NATO countries can kind of see methods which might change over time in how Russia or hostile actors might use threats on critical infrastructure. Just thinking about drones around airports at the moment, that seems to be a new thing. So as soon as we have monitoring capabilities for undersea cables, there seems to be something else. How would NATO kind of workshop protective strategies for those new technologies?
That's a really good question. So the critical infrastructure piece, we always say, is basically like what cyber was 10 years ago, right? So when people first started to understand the threat that cyber was, it was like, oh my God, how do we even get our heads around this issue? We'll never get it. Well, they did. They I mean, haven't solved it, but there's been a lot of increase in how they understand that. So that's kind of where we are with critical infrastructure. And a lot of that goes to the education piece. It goes to the societal resilience piece. Like, that's very hard, right? But you have to do it. And so much of it is education. One of the other, I mean, I didn't even talk about the cyber issue, which is also a threat to critical infrastructure. Like, if you think about it, you have private actors of all different sizes. So you have hyperscalers and Microsofts, the Googles on one hand, and then you have a very, very small little local provider, which maybe doesn't even have antivirus software on their computer, right? So you have to think like that is a huge threat. And so thinking through how can you give education and how can you make standards to help small and medium enterprises to be able to sort of protect like the whole as a larger piece. And that's very difficult to do, actually. But in terms of the reactivity, it's thinking through and always anticipating new challenges. And I think the one that everybody's really concerned with now is the threat that comes from internally. Like, we're seeing a lot of sabotage happen through Telegram. So people are reached out to on Telegram, offered a couple €100, and then they can either plant a bomb or even like stick up flyers or anything like that. And so thinking through how can we change the messaging around that? How can we reach out to people that might be vulnerable to this type of approach? And that comes from this sort of larger societal resilience and thinking through what are we willing to take as a society? What are the challenges internally that we need to manage? Because that all goes back to the whole point of hybrid, which is thinking that democracies are vulnerable targets to hybrid attacks.
Hello, my name is Jeremy. I'm a first year IR student. So I've got two questions for you. First, how can NATO better burden, like the burden of everything that's being attacked against them? How can they share that burden better, especially for countries that are more geographically removed compared to others? For example, Spain, considering its underwater cables aren't being cut like that of the Baltics. And when it comes down to societal resilience, how do you motivate those people living in Spain to have the same tangible fear of Russians when it's not particularly in their back door? Additionally, how can NATO incorporate better red lines for negligence as well? Thank you.
Oh, you guys are asking the good questions here. Okay, so burden sharing across NATO's AR is tough. It is frankly quite difficult to get somebody in Greece, for example, to care about cable cuts in the Baltic. That is a problem not just in critical infrastructure, but in everything. And so one approach that we took at NATO was just actually breaking NATO up into smaller regions and working that way first. Because NATO is a consensus organization, it is very difficult to get consensus on anything in NATO, but specifically when it only affects some states more than others. And so in that sense, you have to break it up into small groups, and you get sort of regions working within NATO together and increase cooperation. Like, for example, in critical infrastructure, the Baltic states work really well together, and the North Sea states work really well together, and they take initiative on their own. So, for example, the North Sea states, kind of led by the Belgian government, actually, they put together their own reporting system where you can call into this system and report things from all different angles in the North Sea, and they will easily share information with each other because they trust each other. So that helps kind of actually reduce that cooperation and trust issue when you sort of break it down into smaller bits. But nevertheless, like, your point is really well taken, because it is a whole of society approach, and like, you do need NATO to work together as a whole to be effective. And this is frankly, one of Russia's longtime strategies, not just for NATO, but just for the entire European project. I mean, Russia's plan was always to divide and conquer, right? To deal with countries bilaterally rather than as a unit, because that reduces bargaining power and make things easier for Russia, right? So this is exactly what they try to do, actually, and this is why these hybrid attacks are concentrated in some areas more than others, right? It's a part of this sort of widen the schism between different actors. Now, that said, European infrastructure is, like I said, very, very interconnected. So when you had that horrible blackout in Spain, it wasn't just Spain that was affected. I mean, this was a huge European issue. And so thinking through how these connections are, and frankly, there's going to be more connections, like the whole European Union energy plan is basically built on increasing interconnectors and grids over the next 10 to 15 years. That's part of Repower EU. So they will become more and more interconnected. So when you do have problems in certain areas, it might take a little while, but you're going to get effects downstream in educating the European populace that these things are all connected, and that the European energy resilience in particular comes from its ability to work as a whole rather than to work as regions or even individual countries, is going to be a very important message.
Did you get the second half here?
Oh, sorry, red lines. Yeah, red lines. Okay, this is a huge deal, and it's a great question. So I think traditionally, countries in Europe and the West in general have not been good about communicating what their expectations are and what will happen if you cross those red lines. So the example that I always like to use is Norway. Norway has an excellent example for being able to work with the Russians, to continue to work with the Russians, even when relations are dire. They're one of the few places in Europe that has actually continuing working relationships. They have border issues, and they also have fisheries issues and coast guards still working together with the Russians because they have to, right? Like you must work together and be able to cooperate. Many other countries have no person-to-person working cooperation with Russia at all. But the Norwegians have been, for many years, very clear at communicating expectations and very clear at communicating what will happen if you do not abide with those expectations, and then standing up to it. So that's red lines in a way. And like, the red lines can be about something like, fisheries, but that's still a red line. And it's still about having that working relationship. Because I think, for fortunate or unfortunate ways, the lack of cooperation with Russia was very problematic, right? Like, the Russians are a problematic regime, but you cannot just ignore them and pretend that they don't exist. There are things that have to be done practically, and the Norwegians understand that, right? And I think that for the US, for example, which is far away and can say, we don't want to have any cooperation with you, well, that leads to problems down the line. If you don't have anybody that knows a Russian person, who are you going to call when there's some crisis? That doesn't exist anymore. And that's really been taken out of the transatlantic relationship with Russia, basically writ large. There's no person to person. There's no science. I mean, even at like the worst parts of the Cold War, you would have scientific cooperation. You'd have scientists, I don't know, going to Lake Baikal and study some algae or whatever, or working in space. Like, that always existed.
Arms control negotiations, even if you had no agreement.
Exactly.
You had a regular
meeting with your counterparts.
Yeah. When you're talking about these issues.
That existed all throughout the Cold War. It has not existed for quite some time now, between Russia and the US and many countries in Europe and Russia. And that's, I think, frankly, quite alarming when you do get these situations in which there's the miscommunication and you don't have anybody to talk to, you don't have anybody to trust. Yeah.
Question. I'm just going to scoot over to get to the online question.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm Manshulika. I'm first year MAIR student. You touched a bit lightly about cyber attacks, and many countries have since been developing their own like cybersecurity act, identifying what is considered critical infrastructure in their cybersecurity act, and establish certs for each sectors. Do you think that protecting critical infrastructure will have like similar approach to Cybersecurity Act? Should it be incorporated into like existing Cybersecurity Act, or should it take like different approach? And what authority should be like more, should it be more civilian led or military led? Thank you.
It's a very good question. I don't think I have a great answer for you because everybody's going to make determinations on their own, right? So what we've seen now, this is now, I'd say like a couple years after really bringing the protection of critical infrastructure into the governance space, is there's actually quite a bit of fragmentation and competing schemes. And this sort of always happens, right? When you have a new sort of security issue. So like, for example, in critical infrastructure, you had no place to report incidents at all. Like a company would have some sort of incident and they would have literally no idea who to call. To them, within the space of 2 years, now we have the Belgian government's North Seal. You have UK DESNZ, which is Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. They have their own reporting scheme. You have NATO's reporting scheme. You have the EU reporting scheme. So now you have all these different places where you can report incidences, but private sectors are now like, well, which one do we use? Right? So that's a problem. It just goes on and on. Now you have so many EU directives and initiatives and different frameworks working on protection and critical infrastructure. You also have NATO frameworks protecting them. It's a political question about whether you think who should be the one protecting this. I mean, the EU has its own military forces actually working on protecting this. So the fragmentation can be quite difficult, especially when you're dealing with already such a highly fragmented problem. I would argue that NATO is a really good place to deal with this because they have both the wide mandate from its member states, but also they have assets to actually deploy if you want to do that. But on the other hand, like this is a real issue that has to do with the private sector and civilian firms as well. So you have to have some sort of body or some sort of facilitation to make that communication a little bit easier. Again, right now we're in the proliferation area. We'll see how that actually whittles down practically to hopefully a less competitive environment for reporting.
Let me jump in and get one online question, and it's sort of a, you were talking about what's the problem of NATO, which is all the NATO has different funding, different capabilities, and then the questioner, George Carlisle, says that's why the U.S. is dispensable. So, whereas the U.S. has money, technology, and can go anywhere. So what about the role of the U.S. in protecting European critical infrastructure under the NATO umbrella when it's not necessarily, fundamentally U.S. infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue though that the US and Europe are connected by critical infrastructure by some very, very important and sensitive pieces of critical infrastructure that go across the Atlantic. Taking the sort of political question out of it in terms of America's role in Europe, I'll leave that aside for another set of issues. If you look at NATO's AOR in terms of sea, where does it go? Does anybody know? It goes into it's the Atlantic. It's the entire Atlantic, right? So that is a U.S. responsibility. The U.S. has its own sets of actors that work to protect critical infrastructure within various different bodies, including the U.S. Navy. And they have to work together with the Europeans to figure out what is the best way of, again, organizing the responsibility, where is the C2, sort of all the questions that I've discussed earlier. But there absolutely is a role for the United States. And I will say this one thing, because I've been on sort of a speaking junket in the past few weeks to European audiences who have been asking me in particular, what is happening with U.S. policy towards Europe, right? Because of the political rhetoric. And here's what I will say. When it comes to alliance and military affairs, you're actually not seeing that much of a difference. So you're seeing some really crazy rhetoric in terms of, certain actors within the U.S. government advocating for a withdrawal from the U.S. But actually, if you look what's going on in the alliance and with NATO, there's not much is being treated very differently in terms of like actual cooperations with the European. Now there's going to be a status of forces. should come up pretty soon. That will basically tell us where, if the US is going to remove some of its forces from Europe, that's what's expected to happen. There still will be obviously forces in Europe, but maybe less so. But at the sort of highest level of cooperation, there still is cooperation between, you know, US military planners who are working in Europe, say like the 4-star level, and the staff and everything. That's still happening, and there still is a sense that NATO is a really important institution, even within the US, despite the sort of political rhetoric. So that said, hopefully that cooperation will remain intact. And, you know, again, like the messaging from the US that burden sharing needs to change, this is, again, not a new message at all. Like, this is something that we've been hearing 40 years, I think.
Yeah.
This is not new at all. It's just that the timeline has been basically brought to now, and like you're seeing this now with European defense budgets increasing. You know, nevertheless, even if you do get European defense budgets increasing to 4%, 5%, whatever, the biggest contributor will still be the US. And so I think it's very easy in European capitals to sort of write the US off and say, like, okay, they're gone, they're out. They're not out. You can't have any serious discussions about security without the Americans. They're the biggest market. We were having a conversation with lunch about defense and tech. Again, you need the American market. And so you have to have these sort of cooperative discussions with the United States about how can you work together. You know, it is my personal view as sort of a transatlanticist is that, you know, if you want to have a competitive West, you need to have a very robust transatlantic relationship. That's my personal stance. I'm not speaking for any organization now. And so I think if you're thinking through like protection of critical infrastructure and hybrid, for example, that relationship needs to remain robust, and thinking through what are these important pieces of infrastructure that supports our society and all aspects of our society, economics, defense, everything, and how can we best protect them? And frankly, like this is an area which is growing. Tech and AI and cables is something that is growing and is massively putting a strain on what is going to be built and our ability to fix it. So another thing I didn't even discuss in this conversation is that right now we are doing a lot of construction. We're building many more data cables. We're hamstrung in our ability to fix it because we don't have enough ships to make these sorts of repairs. So we need to invest in shipbuilding. This is something that's happening sort of in lots of places. This is happening in Germany. This is happening all over Europe. This is happening in the US. The South Koreans now have bought a very famous shipyard in Philadelphia. Like, this is something that needs to change. We need to have more robust shipping infrastructure so that we can repair all of these different things, because that's a constraint right now in terms of how we're able to respond.
More here.
Sorry, second question. So there's obviously a couple of years ago the Salt Typhoon attacks by China in the US where they embedded themselves in the telecommunications infrastructure. Is there an awareness of a threat like that in NATO for Europe, or are they more concerned with kind of more low-level Chinese attacks? And because that's a relationship where there does seem to be more dialogue between European countries and Chinese, how does that play out in practice?
It's very complicated. I think that in Europe right now, people are preparing for the worst in everywhere, but you have different perceptions across different European capitals about threat perception from China. And that makes it quite difficult to act, right? It's not like Europe has one view on what China is. It's dramatically different views about the level of cooperation or threat from China. And that makes it quite difficult, particularly in a body like NATO, to figure out how do you respond to this. Again, like in NATO, there's a wide diversity of members. I won't name names, but there are some NATO member states that won't condemn some of our biggest adversaries, right? And so you have to think through how can we best protect it when we're not going to get consensus on some of those different actions. You also have different areas of Europe that are not NATO member states having quite significant interactions with the Chinese in terms of building infrastructure. Thinking of Southeastern Europe, for example, certain countries there. And NATO is, of course, aware of that. And one of the things that the NATO and US military has been working very hard at is trying to reach out to Southeast Europe and to make inroads into the Balkans and particularly in Serbia, if I'm being frank, in trying to just make more connections, to build trust, all of those things. And unfortunately, I think one of the very unfortunate things that has happened over this past year with a lot of the budget cuts is that initiatives that had been very hard fought for years to work, particularly with the Serbians, have just gone out the window because of funding situation cuts within the US military. And the Chinese have really taken advantage of this. There's a specific project, which I'm thinking of, which I can't really get into specifics, but let's just say the Chinese bought something that the US was trying to work on for about 6 years, and they pulled out, and the next day the Chinese had bought the entire thing. So this is a threat. This is an economic statecraft thing in general. Like, it's thinking through like making investments for strategic purposes and for soft power, and why that's important. And that, of course, is very important for ports in particular. So.
When it comes to NATO's goals of like a whole of society defense approach, how do you feel like the increasing of sensors among the people, right? Whether it's somebody monitoring a Facebook post that, reporting it, or increasing a fisherman reporting on malicious activity in the Baltics. How do you think that increasing civilian involvement could kind of shift the lines in the long scheme of things from hybrid attacks being not only against infrastructure, but also the societal people that are kind of defending it? Do you think that the threshold of violence will shift from that of military to include the civilians? And what are the long-term effects of that?
I mean, I think it already does affect civilians. Like, hybrid attacks in Europe literally happen every day. And it's a huge range of activities. So like, it ranges from blowing up a Nord Stream pipeline, which is a fairly big piece of news, right? To really small pieces of sabotage, mailing things, like campaigns with flyers, like these happen all the time. And so civilian populations are extremely involved in this. These happen through social media campaigns, all sorts of things. Now, what I think NATO is doing, and one of the most important approaches, is educating the populace to say, like, if you see this, who do you report it to and how? Because again, like, I think many of you know, like, there really is a schism between like the broad civilian population and the military, and not knowing how to report them or how to approach them, or where you fit into these lines. And so educating the public to say, like, everybody is a victim of hybrid attacks. Like, your freedom of speech, your right to participate in an election, your right to get unbiased media, like all of this stuff is affected by hybrid campaign. And so being educated about what that looks like, who to report it to, that is really essential. So I would argue, like, these things are already happening, and they affect the populace really every day, whether we notice it or not, I think.
Can I ask a question about, you've had this experience in NATO, and this is, NATO is a defense organization. Can you talk a little bit about, the lead responsibility and then a mindset that comes with it between this is a defense issue versus a law enforcement issue, right? And how, how do you distinguish who takes the lead, what tool there, what's the mindset, what are the legal ramifications of these, and then what are the value added that each of those approaches brings to this problem?
Yeah, it's really complicated because, as I said before, it varies state by state about whether it is a law enforcement issue or whether it's a military issue. And that to this day remains like, different states, even who are neighbors, have different interpretations of this. And sometimes within states, there are jurisdictional fights about who is not sometimes, all the time. There are fights about whose jurisdiction this is. Like, is this a police issue? Is this investigation to police, or is this a military issue? And that is very complicated between each state. Now, on the sort of higher level, working for a defense organization like NATO, you have to be prepared to defend and deter. However, the question of when to act, that is not determined within NATO. Those are political questions, right? So you always have to be prepared to attribute. And when we're at Marcom, this is sort of our mission. We want to know as much as possible to be able to react quickly, to ease attribution, so that if we are asked to act, we can do that. Because again, it's not like a pipeline can blow up and then NATO can say, we're going to go get it. That's a political question. And who is involved in making that political decision? The member states, right? That again, like that's politics sits above the ability of the defense organization to act. And so again, protecting infrastructure is about deterring, it's about understanding the area of operations, and it's about domain awareness at this point, rather than I would say the ability to go out and like either prosecute a campaign or to physically defend from something. And so the idea, because basically you're not going to physically defend something, is to be as present as possible and to say we have the best understanding of our area of operations as possible, so that if there is something, we are likely to see it happen, maybe more likely to see it happen, or to have cameras recording it, so that you are less likely to want to do this. And again, that's really hard when a state, when a boat can just drag an anchor across. But already we've learned from that. Because now when we or a private operator sees a boat loitering in a place that it's maybe unusual for it to be loitering, we say, call us and let us know right away so we can send some sort of vehicle out there immediately. And actually one thing that's happened already is that there have been boats that have been moving across with like, and somebody experiences a disruption, and we're able to get the information right away to interdict that boat before it continues to, say, drag its anchor across another section of the infrastructure. And that is done through sensors and through basically communicating with the private sector to say, like, okay, if you have a sensor disruption, please tell us. You can reach us at any time of day, right? And so that's like, that seems so simple to just get that message out there to the private sector to say, we're open 24/7, NATO's open. You can contact us at 3 a.m, right? And somebody will be there. That seems so simple, but that actually is a huge step forward in being able to sort of figure out the next move and protect infrastructure from being damaged further down the line.
So my name is Jason. I'm first year IA student. It might be too much of a counterfactual, but talk to get about the nature of kind of NATO's information gathering and kind of being open and gathering all this information and data. But then what happens if because the very nature that NATO tries to protect, be it the democratic free world, the very nature of the democratic free world means that the political will does not exist to act on any of the information that you've spent so long gathering. So kind of, is there any potential way forward to kind of counteract that? Or is it because the nature of the democratic system, it means there's always going to be kind of a potential lack of political will in the member states to act against a threat, whether they see it as one or not?
Well, things change very quickly. I mean, I think everybody was surprised when, well, not everybody, but when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, this was a sea change across how European countries thought about defense. I live in Germany. I don't know if there's any Germans in the room here, but basically prior to 2022, it was like unthinkable to be having conversations about defense the way that they're being had now in Berlin. It was unthinkable to think about the amount of money that is going towards private sector defense companies to have this flowing. I just came from the Berlin Security Conference where I was speaking the other day, and I was showing Drew, there was outside an enormous billboard by Helsing, which is an AI company. They basically do AI software for drones, that had pictures of these drones, and it said, buy Europe, for Europe, Helsing. I can't tell you how shocking it is that there would be a poster like this on the streets of Berlin. This was a country that did not engage in security talk. It was almost distasteful to speak about security and defense in such a way. And that has been a complete sea change. Now, this is a serious conversation happening in all European capitals about how better to protect themselves, rather than just saying the Americans will do it. So things do change very quickly. I also think about energy. So I've been a scholar of energy. I wrote my PhD dissertation on Gazprom in Europe. And I spent years examining why states refused to get off Russian energy when they could, and trying to understand that decision to do so. So much time and money and lobbying went in for decades in the EU to try to get them to get off of Russian gas. Nobody would do it. This conversation would not happen. And then basically overnight in 2022, it happened overnight. So you get these events that are extremely disruptive that really can change behavior. Nobody ever accused the EU of moving fast. I mean, they moved so fast when it came to removing Russian energy from the European market. They put out Repower EU within about 3 months. And regardless of what you want to think about that program and its magic math, its ambition is something to be applauded. And they have made huge strides in removing Russian energy. Now, are there consequences to that? Yes, but that's a separate matter. So things can change really quickly. We are in a fundamentally different place in 2025 than we were in 2022 when it comes to thinking through defense and thinking through countries' willingness to make smart decisions about defense. Fundamentally different environment. And so who knows what will happen in the future and what sort of events will move to potentially create even more unity across NATO. And I mean, I'm sure you guys remember, I mean, I wouldn't say NATO was dead, but NATO was in like a serious identity crisis prior to 2022. There were conversations of if NATO would even continue. It truly was a existential conversation for the future of this alliance. It is no longer that conversation. It was completely revitalized. Now, again, there are challenges, but it is in a different place now than it was in 2022, for sure.
Looking at the online questions, I think you gave some sense of paths forward. You're talking about that. The other question was, when are we going to start doing our own hybrid attacks? And I'll sort of frame this a little differently, which is, who does those things? Is that a national thing versus an alliance thing? And what do you think about that distribution of responsibilities?
So even removing the sort of a potential campaign, I think it's important that I don't think I said this enough during this presentation. Protecting critical infrastructure is a national responsibility, and it remains so to this day. NATO can step in when the nations ask for it to help, but it cannot go in to any state and take over. And that's a national level responsibility. And so if a state wants to keep it a national level responsibility, it will be. Some states in the NATO alliance are just more willing to turn it over to NATO to deal with or to cooperate with NATO. But in the end, it's ultimately a national level decision that it lies with. And so any sort of potential campaign would also be a national level decision. NATO is a military alliance and states contribute assets to it, right, and have leadership for it, but they also have their own national level responsibilities and militaries, and it depends on the size of the country and history and all sorts of things for their ability and willingness to sort of cooperate with NATO. So, for example, when there have been attacks of critical infrastructure that affect several different states altogether, even within those incidents, there have been different sets of willingness, whether to work together with NATO or to want to keep it as a national level responsibility, even with states that are ultimately very cooperative with each other. And so there's always that tension, right? And so you have generally larger states tend to have a little bit more independence in this than others. Some are quite cooperative, some aren't. But again, like this is all national level responsibilities that NATO can then step in and help with or ameliorate challenges. But you're never going to take that ultimate decision-making capacity away from the national level.
Any other questions? Yeah. Andy, go ahead.
Andy again. This came up last night at our victory celebration for the group. I was speaking to several members who participated in the war game, and I'm just curious, your interactions with industry, with the hyperscalers in particular. It seems that the military and think tanks are very good at using war games to think through crises that may occur in the future, things and create ways you might react and respond and prepare for them. In your experience, do you think that these hyperscalers they have a similar wargaming approach, or is there potentially a market for a group of people with experience in doing so to fill that void?
In my experience, they do not do this. They are quite impressed by the military's ability to do this. They are also, frankly, a little intimidated by it. And by the way, this goes for all kinds of groups. Like because Drew and I have done actual war games, and I think when you tell people what a war game is, they tend to think of it as either like moving ships on a piece of paper or using a computer, and sometimes that is part of it, and it can be extremely technical in adjudication. We know this, like extremely technical, but not all games have to be that way. They can be super, super simple, sort of facilitated discussions and role play with scenarios. And I think, well, I know that there certainly is a market to do this for the private sector. They would love this. They just have no understanding of what it is, how to do it, and how it might be helpful to them. So it's talking through how you can help them, how you can think through how this might facilitate their decision making, how it might help them solve future challenges, and then being really specific about the methodology that you're using to help them do this. So there's a huge amount of interest to do this. Absolutely.
There's at least one SAIS graduate who's helped stood up a German wargaming center in Germany. That's a sort of a private entity that's working both with the government and with some private sector there.
Yeah, there's a lot of these kind of shops that are being set up or do set up now, like with former military people. They bespoke ones. They sort of exist all over. And then you have like the big places that do games for other people. I mean, Rand does this for other people. You have Nebraska that does this for other people. There's lots of different places that War College, frankly, does this for many people. So, yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Please join me in thanking Dr. Holland for his time.